Hey everybody, this is going to be our last lecture in our unit on swing music. We're going to talk about the decline of swing and the fragmentation of jazz, and we're going to talk about the post-World War II musical environment. The first thing to start talking about was just how sudden and how surprising the decline of swing music was. Towards the end of World War II, by the time you're getting to 1944, the war ends in 45, things were going very well in the war. And if things continued the way they were going, it looked like America and their allies were going to win the war. And so by that time, people were starting to look forward to what a post-war America was going to be like. And there was a lot of excitement in the music industry about swing music after the war. There had been a lot of restrictions placed on Americans during the war. We're going to talk a bit more about some of these later on. But there were a lot of limitations, for example, in terms of what you could buy. There weren't a lot of consumer goods being produced during the war because most manufacturing was going towards the war effort and just more essential needs for the American public. There were price controls. There were limits on buying gasoline, so that was limiting the amount that you could travel. And there was a lot of excitement about when the war was over, a lot of these restrictions would go away. One of the things that had been restricted was shellac. Shellac was the main ingredient back in those days in terms of making records. About 70% of shellac was being used by the government for military purposes. So that limited record production at the time. So there was a lot of excitement about once the war is over, we'll be able to get more records, bands will be able to travel more freely. This music had been spread all across the globe by American service members, as we talked about. There was a lot of excitement that once the war was over, swing music was going to boom bigger than it had ever boomed before. But exactly the opposite happened. By the time the war was over, swing music was going to go into a pretty precipitous decline. And there were going to be a variety of reasons for why this happened. One of them had to do with the economic realities after World War II. Let's go back to these restrictions that were being placed on many Americans during the war. To give you one example, gasoline was being rationed. So you only got so much gas per week for the typical American. Swing bands were not excluded from this rationing. So touring around the United States became quite challenging. It was difficult to get tires for vehicles because there was lots of military applications for rubber that was used in making tires. So getting new tires could be a really challenging issue. There were taxes that were being levied on entertainment venues during the war to help raise money to pay for the war effort. Because so many musicians were drafted and volunteered into the military, there was a shortage of talented musicians that were left. And so that meant talented musicians had a lot of bargaining power with band leaders in terms of asking for more money to stay in a band. You know, you're playing with Benny Goodman, and Benny Goodman is paying you $50 a week, but Artie Shaw needs a trumpet player. You're a trumpet player. And he's offering to pay you $75 a week. So you tell Goodman, either pay me $75 or I'm going to Artie Shaw. And that happened a lot. And so prices went up during the war. So it became very expensive to have swing bands during the war. However, during the war, American consumers had a lot of money. There were minimum wage laws that were instituted temporarily during the war. And so wages were very strong. Unemployment was very low during the war. Excuse me. There were caps that were placed on prices to prevent inflation during the war. So prices for goods were rather low for most staple goods, for food, for rent, for things like that. And there wasn't a lot of consumer goods, like I talked about, for you to buy during the war. So people, for the most part, had jobs and were making good money, but they didn't have a lot to spend their money on. Well, one of the things you could spend your money on was going out and seeing swing bands, going out and going dancing, buying some drinks while you were out there. So although the price for bands in terms of touring and the cost of keeping a band together rose during the war, that was okay because consumers were willing to pay more during the war because they had a fair amount of money in their pocket and not a lot of other stuff to buy during the war. Well, once the war ended, price controls and unemployment returned. There was a short recession at the end of the war because so many of the factories that had been retooled to build things for the war, airplanes, guns, bombs, bullets, things like that, needed to be shut down and reconverted into the manufacturing of consumer goods. You could start building refrigerators again. You could start building radios again. But in the meantime, those workers that had been working in the war factories, many of them were laid off while factories were retooled and things were readjusted. So the American economy goes into a slight recession after the war. People had less money in their pockets. Price controls came off. So prices started to increase. We got inflation in the American economy. So things that were affordable during the war, now the prices were starting to go up. Those swing bands that had a very expensive payroll, somebody like Benny Goodman that we've talked about a lot, had during the war to pay his musicians a lot of money. And that was okay during the war because consumers were more willing to spend money. But now there was more unemployment, and now there were no more price controls. So prices were going up. So people didn't have enough money. But all the musicians in Goodman's band still expected to get paid like they were getting paid during the war. And so there was a rather sudden economic shift that happened at the end of World War II that threw the economics all out of balance. It was very expensive for band leaders to tour, but less money was coming in. And so one of the things that's interesting, if you look at the music magazines from 1945 and 1946, there were still a lot of popular swing bands, but they were starting to disband and shut down operations. Every month you would read one or two new stories about a famous band leader suddenly firing all the guys in his band. Because what was happening was it was costing band leaders more money to keep their musicians employed than it was to the money that was coming in from their concerts and shows. And so what happens to any business, if you think of a band leader as an entrepreneur running a business, what happens with any business in which expenses start to become more than revenue coming in? You're going to go out of business. And that's what was starting to happen with some of these band leaders, because the economics of swing music was all out of whack by the end of the war. Now, some of these bands started to reform later on. for some of these musicians who had started making a lot of money playing in swing bands during the war, they didn't want to take lower salaries until many of them were fired, and then they weren't making any money. And so what some people like Goodman did is they just fired all the musicians and said, sorry guys, I can't afford all of you. There's more expenses here than revenue coming in. And he fired all the guys. And then for some of these bands, 6 months later, a year later, they started rehiring musicians at lower costs, reflecting the new reality of demand and economics in America. So part of the sudden surprising decline of swing music just had to do that the economics had all suddenly changed. But there was something else going on. There was also a generational shift that was going on. That generation that had grown up during the Great Depression, and then the Great Depression leads right to World War II in the early 40s. The Great Depression and World War II had put certain limits on young people and their lives and the decisions that they could make. Maybe you wanted to get married in the late 30s or early 40s before the war started, but you didn't have regular income. You weren't sure if you could support yourself. So you didn't get married. A lot of people try to wait to get married until they can take care of themselves. They can support each other. And so marriages were delayed. And then comes World War II, where boyfriends were separated from girlfriends. And then the war is over and the Great Depression is over. Yes, there's a little recession for about 6 months after the war. But after that recession having to do with the readjustment of the economy and the conversion from war production to the making of consumer goods, the American economy starts to grow. There are a lot of jobs available. And because of that, that swing generation kind of grows up overnight. Usually there's a more rolling quality to people getting married and settling down and having children with a generation. But what happened with this swing generation is once World War II ends, sailors and soldiers and Marines start returning from overseas. Normal life starts to continue, returns. The swing generation grows up. They start getting married. They start having kids. They start having lots of kids. This swing generation, these are the parents of the baby boomers that we hear so much about. It's a period from about 1943, even before the war starts, until the early 60s. That's the generation that the boomers were born into. And it's this big demographic bubble where lots of children were born. This swing generation sort of settles down right around the same time. They get married. They have kids. They start buying houses, increasingly in the suburbs. We're going to talk more about this in later units about this generation also. And what happens is the swing generation kind of grows out of swing culture. Swing music was a dance music. Swing music was a party music. Swing music was a go out and have a good time music. But once the swing generation gets married and starts having kids and increasingly buying homes in the growing suburbs of the United States, that swing music doesn't really fit with their environment anymore. You don't, it's harder to go out dancing when you have kids. You have bills to pay. You have diapers to buy. You have college funds to start saving for. Life becomes more domesticated for many married couples with children. And so part of what's going on is just a sudden generational shift where that swing generation just isn't going out anymore. They're not buying as many records. They're not spending money at dance clubs and going out and drinking like they were. Normally this is more of a gradual, staggered phenomenon. But because of the circumstances of the war ending, just like with economics, it happens very suddenly. This is another reason why it was such a surprise. People just didn't anticipate the extent to which that swing generation was going to settle down and get married and start having kids. And as they were doing that, they just weren't going out as much as they used to. Right. And then you start to get, other types of music that start competing more directly with swing music. We talked previously about the increasing popularity of vocal music during World War II. Ehrenberg, in your book, talks about how the immediate way that vocal music, because of the use of language, can connect with audiences, resonated with an anxious, worried American public during World War II. Talked about how the musicians' strike also affected the growing popularity of vocal music. Well, this trend continued and accelerated after the war. Vocal music becomes more popular. Many of those boy and girl singers for the big bands go out and strike it out on their own and have very successful solo careers afterwards. We talked about all of this. But now let's put together some of what we were just talking about, where you get this sort of generational shift where people are spending, that swing generation is spending more time within the home and less going out to clubs and dance halls and listening to swing music. Well, that vocal music sort of matches the environment of the home better. Don't get me wrong. Some people were getting married and having kids and still listening to swing music in their home. Still listening to that dance music in their home. But some people were just kind of growing out of that music. Sometimes as we age, often when we age, our musical taste starts to evolve and starts to change. And that vigorous music you loved so much when you're a kid, sometimes when you're older, just doesn't match where you're at in the world now. And so some of those, swing fans, they will always love that swing music of their youth. There will always be a sentimental attachment to that music. But now in their suburban home with their husband, their wife, their kids, now more of them are starting to listen to vocal music. They're listening to more Frank Sinatra and Joe Stafford and Peggy Lee rather than the swing bands of their youth that you started to get. So by the end of the war, and very quickly after the war, swing music starts to lose energy and it starts to decline in popularity. Now, another element of this that happens, and again, this ties in with what we were talking about last time in terms of World War II. We talked about the growing commercial appeal of swing music and the broadened audience for swing music during the war. For example, we talked about Glenn Miller, and Glenn Miller helped create this new sound of swing that gets dubbed sweet swing. It was more commercial. It was less demanding on the listener, less improvisation, less hardcore, more poppy, more commercial. And by the way, Glenn Miller wasn't the only one doing it. There were a number of new bands starting to pop up that were starting to trade on this growing popularity of sweet swing. Well, that was starting to turn off some of the earlier jazz fans to swing music. This is a common dynamic we see in the history of music. I'm sure some of you guys will even recognize this in your own contemporary music and experiences, where there's a certain percentage of musical hipsters that always want to be on the cutting edge. They want to be in that vanguard ahead of most people. And they tend to take pride and revel in their status in the avant-garde. But then when that music that they loved so much starts to become more and more popular, some of these people become disenchanted because it's becoming too popular. It's becoming too commercial. They think of themselves as hipsters, and early on, only hipsters like me enjoyed this music. But now the uncool kids are starting to listen to this music. God forbid if my mom turns to me and says she likes this song. Ooh, now it's time to move on and find the next thing. Some of that started to happen with swing music, you know? So in 35, where Count Basie and Benny Goodman were on the cutting edge, you know, by 1943, 1944, some of those band leaders had been around for a while, and some people thought they were getting too commercial and starting to sell out. New performers were starting to emerge, and they were clearly more blatantly commercial, like Glenn Miller. And so the hipsters were starting to move away, starting to turn on swing music because it was no longer on the cutting edge. I told you in the last lecture that swing music was the soundtrack for World War II. Well, some people don't want to be listening to the soundtrack. They want to be listening to the next thing. And so we start to get a fragmentation of jazz. At the beginning of this unit, I said between the period of 1935 and 1945, roughly that decade we consider the swing era, we often talk about jazz and swing being used interchangeably. I told you guys, it's one of the first things I started talking about in this unit, is don't be confused. When Ehrenberg or I use the words swing and jazz interchangeably when talking about this period, because largely between 35 and 45, swing was jazz and jazz was swing. But after 1945, we get a fragmentation of jazz, where we get different branches of jazz. And so after the war, you had to be more specific. If you just said, I like jazz, somebody might ask you, well, what kind of jazz? You didn't have to worry about that for the most part during most of the swing era, because jazz was swing and swing was jazz. But as we're going to talk about, after the war, three competing branches start to emerge in terms of jazz. And they had different outlooks and different directions, different sounds, and in some ways even different ideologies. Okay, so let's start with one branch, and that was just swing music. Okay, swing music would remain an important branch of jazz for a while. Now, swing goes into decline from its high point from the mid-30s to the mid-40s. But there were still millions of Americans that loved swing music. It just, after World War II, it was not as popular as it had been before. For the rest of the 40s, into the 1950s, into the 60s and 70s, these popular band leaders continued to put on shows and put out records and many of them continue to be successful. Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie continue to work, continue to make money, just not as much as they did before. And so there were still people that loved swing music and continued to go to the shows, dance to it, and buy records. So when we talk about the fragmentation of jazz after World War II, one of those branches continued and remained swing music. But now there were competitors. Okay. One group of jazz fans that became disenchanted with swing music, many of them finding swing music too commercial, too compromised, started to look backwards in time. They looked back towards the 1920s and that 1920s style jazz. And they started to argue that was the real jazz. That was the good stuff. These were traditional jazz fans. Sometimes they were known as trads, just shortened for traditional. People that were critical of this movement sometimes called them moldy old figs, or just shortened it to just figs. As we'll talk about, we're going to talk about bebop. Some of the bebops would talk about the traditional jazz fans and just call them figs, for moldy old figs, just stuck in the past. And increasingly, that 20s style jazz came to be known as Dixieland. And in fact, most commonly today, you hear people describe the jazz of the teens and 1920s as Dixieland. And so you got a certain group of people that they became disenchanted with the popularity of swing music. One hipster move in music is to go back into the past and celebrate the music of the past. One of the places, in more contemporary terms, we see this a lot, is with punk. Okay, people will go back. Punk fans are almost cultish, almost religious in their commitment to punk music from the 1970s into the probably around the mid-80s. That period in the 70s and first half of the 80s was the golden age of punk. The Circle Jerks, the Dead Kennedys, Black Flag, that was real punk. That was the good stuff. And even if you weren't alive during that period of time, some punk fans will say that was the golden age. That was the best. And everything else that comes after it is either inferior or fake. Green Day and Blink-182 and Good Charlotte, all those fake punk bands, that's not the real stuff. The real stuff was that 70s and 80s stuff. That was the golden age. Well, that exact dynamic was happening with traditional jazz, where in the swing era, some jazz fans, many of them who started liking swing in the beginning, that in 1935, 6, 7, were fans of Benny Goodman and Count Basie, started to become, as time went on, somewhat disenchanted as the music became more and more popular, and started to look back towards the jazz of the 1920s, that hot sound of the 20s, and say, you know what? This commercial poppy stuff today, that's not real jazz. You want real jazz? That's stuff in the 1920s. So you got a whole revival for 1920s musicians. Some of them had tremendous revivals in terms of their career. A guy by the name of Bunk Johnson, who early in the swing era had long been forgotten, African-American jazz musician from the 20s, started to have a revived career as people started to look for his old records. and start to go to shows that he was putting on. Let's listen to Low Down Blues from Bunk Johnson just to give you a sense of the revival of that 20s sound. All right, you can see even in this selection off Spotify, it falls under a Dixieland category here. That's more of that 1920s style sound that you have there. Smaller combos, more freedom for improvisation, less in terms of written arrangements that you get with this sound. There were some people that were going back and arguing that was the true jazz, and they started to develop their own subset, their own culture. They got record stores that just catered to these fans. Before some of these records were getting reissued, before some of the record companies realized there was a demand for these old records, traditional jazz fans went to great lengths scouring secondhand stores looking for old 1920s style records. It was hard during the war because during the war, you could get money for turning in old records because the shellac was so in demand that the government was buying up and dealers were buying up shellac. So a lot of these pre-war records that were becoming harder and harder to find. And so there was almost like a fetish quality of these traditional jazz fans in terms of finding and maintaining these old records. They had their own magazines. Esquire magazine became one of the places that had journalists that were real advocates making this argument that the traditional jazz was the real jazz. So they had their whole thing going on. One of the problems, and it's, by the way, is one of the problems that you get with punk in terms of more contemporary music, that the problem with this backwards looking was that it's something of a dead end. If a golden age of music happened decades earlier, how can you have innovation? How can you have newness? These traditional jazz fans, a lot like contemporary punk fans, anything today is never good enough because it's never going to be as good as the old stuff. And so Ehrenberg talks about these traditional jazz fans sort of box themselves into a kind of dead end where it became almost like a cult, not a literal cult, but a musical cult, where you were just so stuck in the past that anybody who tried to deviate from this older tradition gets accused of being a sellout or too commercial or just not good. So it was something, there was a limit to how broad the appeal of this could be because it was just kind of a musical dead end. Now, if there was one group of jazz fans that were looking back towards the past for musical inspiration, there was another group that was looking towards the future. And those were the fans of bebop. Talked about bebop a little bit. I played you a little Charlie Parker. I played you, I have a clip for you from the movie Bird. For the Jewish wedding scene, and I talked about some of Charlie Parker's experience. Bebop was going to be a style of jazz that emerged during World War II, and it was, in something of a sense, returned to earlier traditions in the sense that, like with traditional jazz bands of the 1920s, bebop had smaller combos, trios, quartets, quintets, smaller number of musicians. Okay, a lot of these guys that were playing in swing bands as side musicians. It was a great gig. They wanted to be in these bands. Many of them were making good money if you were in a popular orchestra. But it could be kind of boring for the really talented musicians. Because, swing had written arrangements and there were opportunities to solo, but the opportunities tended to be kind of short and brief. And oh, by the way, when you played in dance clubs, people there wanted to dance and expected to hear dance music. But sometimes musicians don't always want to play dance music. It kind of limits your options as a musician to always have to play dance music. And so one of the things that was happening during the war is you started to get guys that were in swing bands that after their normal gig was over were starting to play in smaller clubs, in smaller combos, where they could play more challenging music, more solos, less structure, less dance-oriented. And it was in this environment of a younger generation of swing musicians that were often very talented, had tremendous musical aspirations, and wanted to go beyond the limits of playing in these swing bands. And you started to get these musicians. People like Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie got his start playing he played in various bands before, but his big break was playing with Cab Calloway. Cab Calloway was a African-American band leader who a lot of the hipper people in swing thought was kind of corny. He wore these big, oversized zoot suits, and he wasn't really a musician himself. He wasn't a very good musician, and he was more of a showman, and he was a bit corny. And Dizzy Gillespie got fired from Cab Calloway's band because one night at a show, Diz was throwing stuff at his boss during the show, like openly mocking the band leader. He got kicked out. People like Charlie Parker. This is Charlie Parker here. Again, I highly recommend anybody you're kind of interested in learning more about this musical environment. Ken Burns has a 10 or 12 part documentary on the history of jazz that's worth watching. But that movie Bird about Charlie Parker is it's a little depressing, but it's a great movie, and it does a good job of giving the sort of ambiance of 1940s, 1950s jazz world. This, by the way, is Miles Davis, a young Miles Davis in the background. One of the reasons I love this picture is because he's smiling. Miles Davis didn't smile a lot, and so that's kind of I just like that picture because he's smiling in here. And maybe in a little while we'll talk about why Miles Davis didn't smile very much. Let's listen to a little bebop. We'll listen to some examples here. Charlie Parker's nickname was Yardbird, sometimes just shortened to Bird. That's why that movie about him is called Bird. This is a song called Ornithology, the study of birds. Songs tended to be quick, and if not quick, very slow. Not necessarily very danceable. I guess you could kind of dance to this one, but you'd be doing an awfully quick kind of jig trying to dance to this. Okay, the songs could have melodies, but not necessarily poppy, hooky melodies that you might be. Actually, this is a good example of a song that actually did have a pretty strong melody. Lots of soloing, lots of fast soloing, sometimes dissonant soloing. Didn't always sound pretty, right? But it was always interesting, right? Let's listen to another Charlie Parker song with Dizzy Gillespie. This is Salt Peanuts.
At this time, we would like to play a tune that was composed by my worthy constituent, Mr. Dizzy Gillespie, in the year of 1942. We sincerely hope you do enjoy Salt Peanuts.
Extremely demanding form of music, not only for the musicianer, but for the listener, right? This was a musical form that was for the hardcore. This was for the avant-garde. If you wanted something poppy and polite to listen to so you could dance on the floor, this was not the music for you. Okay? So for those people that felt like swing had become too popular, too commercial, not had lost touch with its jazz roots, bebop by 1943, 1944, and then after the war was the music for you. It didn't always have to be fast. It did, but it still remained difficult to play and demanding on the listener. Let's listen to something a little bit more slow. This is a Loverman from the Charlie Parker Quintet. Oops, sorry. Really beautiful song. So Ehrenberg talks about bebop, and by the way, Ehrenberg's not original in this observation, talks about the way in which bebop wasn't just a new style of jazz, that bebop was a sort of frontal assault against swing music. It was a musical revolution. And part of that has to do, he argues, with the failed expectations of swing. There was an interesting thing that happens during World War II in terms of raising the expectations of the African American community during the war. So in our previous lecture on World War II and swing, we talked about the ideological nature of World War II, the extent to which America very openly declared to the world that they were fighting this world for democracy, for freedom, for equality. And yet the reality of America was that there was racial segregation, there was prejudice. But during the war, there was some optimism, particularly within the African American community, that maybe this war in which we are fighting an avowedly racist enemy, Adolf Hitler, with his Nazi ideology, that maybe this is going to be the thing that is going to wake America up. And we're going to take a look in the mirror and realize that Hitler's bad, and Hitler's bad for many reasons, but considerably because of his racism. Well, let's not be like that. So maybe let's change some things here in America. Let's end segregation. Let's treat African Americans and other minorities in better ways. There was a kind of optimism. One of the things that you heard in the African American community during World War II was talk of the double victory, or the double V. And the double victory was that the African American community was engaged in the war effort like all other Americans. The war against external enemies that are trying to attack the homeland. So just like everybody else, the African American community was engaged in a war against external enemies. That was one of the V's, one of the victories to be sought. But the African American community also had another victory to be secured, and that was the victory against segregation and prejudice and racism. And the hope was that African American involvement in World War II was going to help convince other Americans to move away from that racism and prejudice and segregation. That was the second victory that was going to be secured during the war, the victory against segregation and prejudice. But it turns out America didn't really learn its lesson. Yes, things were better within swing culture, less racist than broader American culture. But during the war and after the war, racism persisted, segregation persisted. So much so that there was a kind of disappointment that sets in, but a disappointment that directed towards greater activism. So many impressive gains in the civil rights movement happened after World War II. And the reason for that was because of a greater militancy, a greater insistence by the African American community coming out of World War II. For so many generations of African Americans, there was an understanding that it was going to take time for America to change. Since the abolition of slavery, there was this recognition from African Americans that, okay, things are still not great, but maybe they'll get a bit better during my lifetime, and hopefully better for my children, and definitely, hopefully better for my grandchildren. But we're going to have to be patient. It's maybe not me, but for my grandchildren. But the failed expectations, the expectations that were built up during the war that were not fulfilled, turns out things didn't get that much better. Created a new kind of demanding nature coming out of the war. Less acceptance of the idea of maybe not me now, but for my grandkids. And increasingly a more militant attitude. No, we're not waiting for my grandkids. Now. Things are going to change now. And this is where so many of the gains of the civil rights movement start to come. One of the unfortunate interpretations of post-World War II civil rights movement is somehow this idea that just somehow white people became more cool. And that's why things started to change. Instead of recognizing what really happened, in which it was more of the work of African Americans and the risks that were being taken within the African American community, and civil rights leaders and just average people following along with the civil rights movement that became more demanding and more militant, that started to demand that change was going to start to happen now. Ehrenberg argues there's a kind of similarity to this shift from swing music towards bebop in jazz. That swing music was a kind of attempt at a belief in integration, a belief in the possibility that things could improve. But by the end of the swing era, African Americans still weren't being treated equally. Even within swing culture, black jazz musicians didn't get the same kind of opportunities that white musicians received. And this younger bebop generation, people like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, were becoming more militant in terms of music. We're becoming more demanding, okay? More desirous of being treated with respect, being treated like artists. Miles Davis here, who started out in bebop and then moved beyond bop as time went on. One of the reasons Miles Davis just didn't smile very much is because some of these bebop musicians became almost offended by the idea of the musician as an entertainer. For so many generations of black musicians and entertainers, to be popular with white audiences required you to seem non-threatening to white audiences. So a lot of smiling, a lot of joking. And Davis and some of these younger bebop musicians were like, no, I'm a musician. I'm an artist. I'm not here to tell you jokes or to smile at you between songs. I'm here to share my art with you. And if you are discerning enough and have a good enough ear, you can partake of my art, but you're not getting anything else from me. So Davis wasn't going to smile at you. He wasn't going to tell you jokes in between. Sometimes Davis would turn his back to the audience. He was a trumpet player. Turn his back to the audience for extended periods of time, which is not good stagecraft in traditional entertainment. You don't turn your back to the audience for extended periods of time. But he did that on purpose. It was kind of a test for the audience. Are you here for the music or not? Right? There was a kind of demand. You could see, if you Google Dizzy Gillespie and look at pictures, young Dizzy Gillespie, there are a lot of pictures of him wearing berets with a little soul patch and round glasses. He almost had this kind of nerdy post-war kind of Greenwich Village beatnik artist look to him, because that was the atmosphere that these guys were working at. They played artistic, demanding, non-commercial music. Right? And because of that, bebop was never terribly popular. It didn't have a big audience because it was just too much for most people. Right? And so the greater militancy we see, the greater assertiveness we see in the broader African American community moving into the post-World War II civil rights movement. People have argued, and Ehrberg is one of them, argues we see some of that more demanding nature even in the music itself in jazz. You have people like Miles Davis saying, I'm not going to let you disrespect me. I'm not here to be your entertainment. I'm an artist. I'm a musician. I will share my art with you. And if you can appreciate that, you are welcome. But don't expect anything more from me. Don't expect me to entertain you. Don't expect me to tell you jokes. Ehrenberg argues that bebop is a reflection partly of the failed expectations of swing, that the swing culture was supposed to be more democratic, more egalitarian, more participatory, but ultimately swing culture could never achieve equivalency, where African Americans and whites were treated exactly the same throughout swing culture. And because of that, there was a certain disenchantment that develops, and bebop rises up out of it and is saying, well, you know, if we can't have that, then we're going to have this demanding music in which in this area in bebop we will be treated like artists and have expectations of being treated as artists. It's a really good chapter. Okay, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this unit on swing music. I always really enjoy it, and next we will be on to comic books. All right, see you next time.